welcome everyone to History Matters, and so does green juice.
Oh,
I did not have time to get coffee. But green juice is good. Okay, you do have coffee in the proper mug, Annie. This is good. Close this here. So today we are going to talk about, we're going to kind of review where we stand with the 14th Amendment, because there's so much talk about it in so many ways, on so many sides, whether it does apply, whether it doesn't apply, that I just thought reviewing that and looking at what people are saying and looking at a historical moment, which may or may not be significant, which is people are not normally commenting on. At any rate, that this would be a useful thing. And as I mentioned before, we were recording and on Facebook, we're going to have primary sources and articles and all kinds of things that the wonderful Tim will be finding and citing. Little did he know until about 30 seconds ago that he would be doing this. But there'll be all kinds of things that you can go and find and read and look at yourself. So it won't simply be me making pronouncements, but actually you can go read where I read what I am speaking about, and you can read all kinds of court decisions and a variety of other things. Okay, but before I keep going, I will turn to my partner in crime who is patiently waiting, Annie, and she can explain the rules of the game.
good morning, everybody. I'm Annie Evans from New American History, and I'm delighted, as always, to be here with you. We are going to have about a 30-minute discussion with Joanne. I'm going to turn my camera off and listen like everyone else. And then in about a half an hour, I will come back and check that Q&A box. So if you have questions specifically about today's topic, please put those in the Q&A, and I'll be back in about 30 minutes.
Okay. I'm going to begin by doing what one should do when talking about a document of some kind, and that is reading text. And I should say before I begin reading the text, if you are here for the first time at History Matters, please say so in the chat box, and you will get a robust welcome from the wonderful History Matters community. This is our 195th straight episode. Yep, because we are like super commentators. We are a super community. At any rate, okay, text. So I want to just read you part of the 14th Amendment. Here we go. No person shall be a senator or representative in Congress, or elector of president and vice president, or hold any office, civil or military, under the United States or under any state, who having previously taken an oath as a member of Congress or as an officer of the United States or as a member of any state legislature or as an executive or judicial officer of any state to support the Constitution of the United States shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the same or given aid or comfort to the enemies thereof. Okay, so that's a chunk of the 14th Amendment on so many people's minds. Now, the reason that we are talking about it has to do with Colorado, which has just decided that a higher court than the original court that heard this has decided that Colorado should and has the right to remove or bar former President Trump from the Republican primary ballot in the state of Colorado. Now, I'm going to mention a few specifics here because I think often specifics aren't being mentioned, and also because this will be one way in which you can look this up online. The case that decided this was Anderson versus Griswold. And here's why it's called Anderson versus Griswold. The people who brought this case, the people who said that former President Trump should be barred, were six voters in Colorado. Six, and this is according to the people who brought the case, who represented these people, six Republican and unaffiliated Colorado voters, so no Democratic voters. Some of those Republican voters in Anderson versus Griswold included Norma Anderson, former Republican majority leader of the Colorado Senate and House; Krista Kafer, I hope I said her name correctly, Kafer, conservative columnist for the Denver Post; Claudine Schneider, a former Republican U.S. representative. Okay, so obviously they made pains in bringing this case. Democrats aren't a part of it, and there are noteworthy Republicans who were part of this case. Griswold is Gina Griswold, who is the Colorado Secretary of State, who will be determining whether or not former President Trump's name goes on the Republican primary ballot. Okay. So those are the basics. You can look up Anderson versus Griswold and get a lot of information on it, including the entire Colorado decision. Now, I should say some of the things I'm citing today, the Colorado decision is over 200 pages long. So I did not read it in its entirety in preparation for this morning. If I'd had more time, I certainly would have, but it's there and you can find it online. I wanted to explain one aspect of it, and this comes directly from the decision. People have been saying that the decision came with a stay until January 4th. And this is how the Colorado justices who decided this explain this. If a review of this case is sought in the Supreme Court before the stay expires on January 4th, 2024, then the stay shall remain in place and the secretary will continue to be required to include President Trump's name on the 2024 presidential primary ballot until the receipt of any order or mandate from the Supreme Court. So to say that in simpler terms, the stay means that this won't go into effect until the day before the ballots need to be finalized, giving people a chance, to protest against this. And if someone, if former President Trump or his representatives protest against this and it goes up to the Supreme Court, which obviously it in one way or another is going to do, then the stay will remain in effect and this will not immediately take effect. So that's worth noting only because in the end, this decision is extremely significant on a state level, states around the nation, and on a national level. But it's possible that we will not see an immediate impact on the primary ballot in Colorado. I don't know. But that comes from the Colorado Justice's report. Okay, so the report, the 200-page report, determines obviously a lot of things that people are still debating. One of them is whether the 14th Amendment, as I just read, encompasses the office of the presidency. If you were listening, it says, no person shall be a senator or representative in Congress or elector of president and vice president or hold any office, civil or military, under the United States or under any state, or as an officer of the United States, blah, blah, blah. It does not specifically say president. No one shall be president. Elector, yes. President, no. So this decision by the Colorado court, among other things, says that the 14th Amendment does encompass, Section 3 of the 14th Amendment does encompass the office of the presidency, and goes on at length for many, many pages to discuss why they believe this to be the case. They go on to talk about a number of other controversial things about it, let's see here, I cited it down because I wanted to quote it for you. That what's happening here, that the election code allows electors to challenge President Trump's status as a qualified candidate. The election code, it's the main viable means by which this kind of a challenge may be made. So in other words, what's happening here isn't unallowed. It's not something that shouldn't be happening. And I'll make this point, it's at the very end of my notes, but I'll make it here as well. We're watching our judicial process, our system of courts, work its way through a really challenging, difficult, and potentially momentous decision. And that's worth noting because the system is operating. So for people who say, well, this is just, and I'm going to come back to this later, this is just a partisan stab and it's, shouldn't be happening. Well, whatever you consider it, it's going through the courts, and it's going through the courts, the ultimate court of which has many more conservative than otherwise justices. So it is a positive thing that, in this sense, the rule of law and our judiciary system is operating to figure this out. That is going along as it should go along, right? We're watching that in operation. As with so many other things in our current historical moment, it's yet another moment in which something is happening that either has never happened before, is unprecedented, and as a historian, I say that very cautiously, or even if it has precedent, which most things do, hasn't happened in quite this way before. In this case, this hasn't really happened before. There has not been a presidential candidate challenged in this way before. And obviously the outcome will be significant. So we are, as ever, witnessing things that we need to think about and watch and evaluate and read about, which is why I'm going to be offering so many different articles and things that you can read. The first one being, you can find the actual decision by the Colorado court. Now, there's an interesting historical moment that I want to mention, and then I'll come back to others commenting on it. But one of the articles, I read a number of things in the Atlantic this morning. I'll mention them now so that Tim has a long time to find them. I read an article in the Atlantic by Judge J. Michael Luttig and Lawrence Tribe. The Constitution prohibits Trump from ever being president again. That's pretty straightforward. I read an article by Noah Bookbinder and Donald Sherman. We sued to keep Trump off the Colorado ballot. They represented the 6 people and actually named the ones that I mentioned. That comes from them. So they explain what they did briefly. I read Kimberly Whale, I hope I'm saying her name right, Whehle, also in the Atlantic, wrote an article called "The Colorado Supreme Court Decision is True Originalism." She's a law professor. I read, and this is what I'm going to come back to momentarily, an article by Kurt Lash, written in Law and Liberty, which is an online libertarian site. Libertarian, I say only because it's sponsored by the Liberty Fund, which is a libertarian educational organization. And I've worked with them in a variety of ways before, as have a lot of other people of varying politics. They actually really do like to bring people together in conversation. So Liberty Fund, maybe libertarian, but I think they honestly do want to provoke conversation, useful conversation. What else did I read here? I read an article called by Roger Parloff, Parloff, "For whatever reason, quote unquote, will the Colorado Supreme Court apply the constitutional insurrectionist bar to presidents?" I think that's all I read this morning. At any rate, that gives you a sense. It's a range of things, and you'll see within those articles various references to people who like what's happening, who don't like what's happening, who argue that it should be happening, who argue that it's anti-democratic. We'll talk about a little bit about this morning, but there's a range of opinions and views there as far as the legally what's happening right now. And I wanted to provide that so that everyone could read and inform themselves, as we all should do. That's what I meant when I posted on social media that people have come down on all sides. Not that they've come down. Some people said, no, like, we know what Trump did. They didn't come down on all sides about what Trump did. They came down on all sides about whether the 14th Amendment should be enforced and whether it applies. That's what I was interested in talking about. However, let me talk briefly about a historical moment, as I mentioned a few minutes ago. It came from the article by Kurt Lash in Law and Liberty, and then I looked it up to get a little more information on it. So one of the questions that you probably have, and certainly that I had, is why doesn't it say president specifically in Section 3 of the 14th Amendment? Why doesn't it name president? And I thought, I don't know if I will or won't find an answer, but here's a historical moment, and I'll mention the moment. I'll quote what people said. It's a moment from Congress regarding this, and then I'll mention why it may or may not apply. But at any rate, so this happened in the floor debates in Congress, the Joint Committee, during the Joint Committee's discussion of the final version of Section 3. Okay, so this is what happens. This is in the House, and Representative Reverdy Johnson, and Reverdy is just such a great 19th century name. Reverdy Johnson reads Section 3, and then during the debate, he said, wait, it doesn't mention president or vice president. And so this is a summary, and then I'm going to read you what they actually said. When someone interjected and said, no, president falls within what we've said there, Johnson said, oh, okay, I see that, but the text misled me. Now, let me read you the exact words here. Reverdy Johnson was concerned about the draft and said that former rebels, quote, may be elected president or vice president of the United States Why did you omit to exclude them? And Senator Lot Morrill, actually not the House, I said House a moment ago, this is the Senate. Senator Lot Morrill responded, let me call the senator's attention to the words, or hold any office, civil or military, under the United States. Johnson then walked back what he said and said, perhaps I'm wrong as to the exclusion from the presidency. No doubt I am. But I was misled by noting the specific exclusion in the case of senators and representatives. So let me mention that again. A senator, when they were debating Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, says, wait a minute, why don't you mention the president or vice president? And another senator says, it's included in the phrase, or hold any office, civil or military, under the United States. And Johnson says, oh, okay, but the text was misleading. That to me seems like an interesting moment. Now, when I looked around this morning, I was like searching around for commentary on that moment. There's some, but not a lot. As I mentioned before, it was first, I found it first in this article by Kurt Lash for Law and Liberty. But as others point out, it is one exchange between two people in the Senate. There's no absolute proof that everyone else in the room agreed, were listening. Lash says that, because it was unclear at the time whether the president was included, that was generally unclear. And I'm not going to go into depth about his longer article. He wrote a longer article. I read a short summary that he wrote of his longer article. He says that, maybe people shared that misreading. Maybe, there are a lot of maybes here. But the fact of the matter is, there was an interesting moment during the debate over the actual amendment and the particular section of it, in which one of the senators in the room said, why isn't president included here? And another one said, oh, it is. Again, historically speaking, you can't point to a moment and say, like it proves everything. That's what other commentators have said. However, it's worth noting. It's significant. It means that, number one, we're not inventing what's going on now. It's not like people are somehow creating the idea that, that's it. That's the ticket. It includes the president. At the time, people thought about it, asked about it, and at least in this case, we're told, it does include the president. Interesting point. I throw that out there for historical relevance. And again, as a historical fact about what happened, I encourage you to look at it, look for it, find more about it than I did. As I said, I had time to see the initial reference to it by Kurt Lash, and then to rummage around and find a lengthier discussion of specifically what the senator said. But that seems interesting to me, and certainly deserves to be further investigated. And we are nothing if not an educated community of people who like to investigate things. At any rate, that seems significant. One of the also things, sorry guys, haven't had coffee. One of the things that you will also find online is an article. It's an academic article by William Baude, B-A-U-D-E, and Michael Stokes Paulsen, P-A-U-L-S-E-N. And their article is called The Sweep and Force of Section 3. Also 200 pages long. But it's an exhaustive analysis of what Section 3 of the 14th Amendment really means. And I encourage you to go find that. Again, find the Colorado decision and see what they say, because it's not hard to read. It's very straightforward, and they explain what they've decided. They talk about the objections and how they attacked, dealt with the objections and why they feel that what they did makes sense. They talk about the fact that they're not making this on a whim, that they had, reams of evidence and days of debate, and that, it's easy to read. And although this is an academic article, it's pretty straightforward too. And I'll mention again, The Sweep and Force of Section 3 by William Baude. I hope I'm saying his name right, and Michael Stokes Paulsen. Much of this is not highfalutin academic or legalistic jargon. It's pretty straightforward. So if you really want to inform yourself, I encourage you to find this. One of the things that they say in their article, so some people are saying it doesn't include the president. I mentioned something that seemingly at least raises a question about that, that any officer seems to embrace the presidency. And actually the article by the names of these writers, Whale, I don't want to miss her first name, Kimberly Whale, I did it. She says that the presidency is referred to as an office 25 times in the Constitution. I don't know what that proves, but she's trying to link office, a simple reference to office, as the presidency. But at any rate, that article by Bode and Paulson addresses another objection that some people have to what the Colorado court is doing. Some people argue it was meant to be limited to the Civil War. And that, it was about that insurrection. Let's see, I want to know what page I'm on here so I can come back to it. What page am I on here? So I can come back to it. Okay. If you go back to the original language that I started out by quoting, it says, in insurrection or rebellion against the same, or it doesn't say, this one. It just says it, generally speaking, so it doesn't specify that. However, these two legal scholars, who I should say are conservative constitutional scholars who are affiliated with the Federalist Society. So again, the people speaking up here, a lot of the people speaking up in the loudest manner possible are conservative, are on the right, are Republicans, and that's also worth noting. I think in our current political moment, many of us have really, really, really wanted some people on the right, some Republicans, to stand up and speak up and say if they don't like something, or if they object to something, or if they're uncomfortable with something, to stand up and say it. I'm one of those people. Here are some people who are doing that in this moment. There's even an article by, I'm going to say his name wrong too, David Frum, Frum, I'm assuming it's Frum, who says this is the moment when Republicans can seize this moment if they want to get out from under the influence of Trump, if they want to. That's how he presents this. But at any rate, Bode and Paulson, who are these conservative constitutional scholars, among the things that they argue is Section 3 is not something limited to the Civil War. It's an enforceable part of the Constitution. It was not repealed by legislation after it was put into effect. And they also make the important point that it's self-executing, meaning it says if you've done any of these things, then you're barred. It doesn't say you require congressional approval to be barred. It doesn't say you require the president to say it's okay. It's self-executing. So at any rate, here are all of these ways in which a variety of people are grappling with what's going on in this current moment. Whether it does include the presidency or not, and you'll hear many people talking about that. To me, that's an interesting question, but I'm very intrigued by the moment, historically speaking, when it was being created, when someone said it doesn't include the president and someone else said, yeah, it does. I don't know. That's an interesting moment at the very least. Whether it applies to any insurrection, again, the language within it doesn't say this only applies to the Civil War that just happened, although clearly it's the Civil War that prompted it. It was a desire to deal with people who supposedly took an oath of office to serve the government and then joined a war against it, right? Obviously, that's the premise behind it. People are also saying that it's anti-democratic, that this decision is anti-democratic, that the people should be allowed to decide for themselves who they do or don't want to vote for. Now, part of the problem with that is, what do you do if the person you're discussing already was in an election where the people voted and decided not to elect him, and he ignored it? I mean, this is such a messy moment, folks. And it's partly because former President Trump sort of violates norms and challenges or ignores rules, and then sort of, waits for people around him to kind of grapple with the implications. You can debate, as many are, is what happened on January 6th. An insurrection, a rebellion, a riot. What was it? I'm sure we're going to hear a lot of talk about that. Along with, is it anti-democratic? as others in these articles that I read this morning point out, the 14th Amendment doesn't talk about, well, you need a criminal conviction for this to be in effect, right? As I mentioned a moment ago, self-executing, meaning whether or not former President Trump is convicted of engaging in insurrection, engaging in it in and of itself is enough. Again, what is an insurrection? What is a rebellion? Did he engage in it? These are all things we're going to be hearing a lot about in coming weeks. For sure, it is an example of something I've talked about many times here on History Matters, which is words really matter. Because now we are going to be talking about the meaning of insurrection and rebellion. What do they encompass? What do they mean? Suddenly meanings are going to mean a lot. And so are the specific words in the 13th, particularly Section 3 of the 14th, my God, I need coffee, Amendment. Some of the more liberal commentators are noting the fact that people are now reading that section of the amendment in a very literal way. This is what it says. And in that sense, they're taking a sort of more textual and sometimes even originalist approach to what that section of that amendment says, which is typically what this Supreme Court likes to do. Well, let's go back to the original text. Let's focus on how it was intended. And so some liberal commentators are like, yeah, well, so how much were they going to stand by that, given that that's what the Colorado court says it's doing? I could keep going here with the messiness of it, and I see I'm almost out of time. My larger point here is the president encompassed within it? That will be a discussion. I find that historical moment when someone asked that question, when it was being debated, interesting. As another commentator said, not decisive, but very much worth thinking about. Was this an insurrection or a rebellion? Did the president engage in it or not? Is this anti-democratic? And again, anti-democratic meaning that we're allowing the constitutional process and our court system to operate as they're intended to operate to make an important decision. That's what's happening right now. And I might not like the decision. I might like it. I don't know. But what's going on now is what should happen when someone steps forward and challenges a decision like this, whether to include former President Trump or not on the ballot. Now, others make this point, again, another messy point, that what will stop people in the future from doing this about anybody who they want to bar from any kind of a ballot? It's a point to be made. It's not a reason why we should ignore violations and not at least be willing to consider them and talk about what they mean and whether something should or shouldn't be enforced in a given moment. But that will come up as well. The Tribe and Ludwig, when confronted with this, and I'll read their words and maybe conclude with this, and then I know some of you are already screaming mug, 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 so I can't see it because my notes are above it. This is from the article by Tribe and Ludwig. Stanford law professor Michael McConnell cautions that we are talking about empowering partisan politicians, such as state secretaries of state, to disqualify their political opponents from the ballot. If abused, this is profoundly anti-democratic. He also believes, as we do, that insurrection and rebellion are demanding terms connoting only the most serious of uprisings against the government, and that Section 3 should not be defined down to include mere riots or civil disturbances. McConnell worries that broad definitions of insurrection and rebellion, with the lack of concern about enforcement procedure, could empower partisans to seek disqualification every time a politician supports or speaks in support of the objectives of a political riot. Ludwig and Tribe say we share these concerns, and we concur that the answer to them lies in the wisdom of judicial decisions as to what constitutes insurrection, rebellion, or aid or comfort to the enemies of the Constitution under Section 3. So along the lines of what I just said, Ludwig and Tribe are saying these are important points to be made. This is what the courts are in part for. They are operating as they should operate And you can't dismiss this and say it's just partisan because it's gone to the courts. And the courts are somewhat partisan, but not necessarily partisan in favor of liberals. So it's working its way through our system in the way that it should. That's what the system is for. I've said more than once here on History Matters, at the Constitutional Convention, one of the most valuable things that its participants thought that they were doing was simply creating a process of government and putting it in a constitution that would be above other legislation to be in place as a process to resort to when there was a crisis. They were creating a process. The process of creating that process mattered to them. It's part of why Madison took the very detailed notes that he took. How do you make that kind of constitution? What process are you engaging in? The process of governance, the process of government, the process of constitutional government, democratic government, the judicial process, all of those processes matter. And as much as people at this current moment do have very strong feelings about what's happening, the process is in motion, operating as they should operate. That matters immensely too. So that, I think, my closing point here, I'd like to always have sort of moral to the story. And today, obviously, I read like 800 pages and then came to sit down here. So it's a lot in my mind. But as far as the final point here, I will say, reading things, primary evidence, carefully for yourself and thinking about it, considering words and what they mean and how they're being used, thinking about the process in motion and what it's intended to do and what it can do, stopping to consider what someone is trying to get from you if they're screaming emotionally about something. If someone comes forward screaming about this decision in some way that you feel is meant to get your emotions riled up, as I've said many a time, pause for a moment and think about why that person is doing what they're doing and what they want from you before responding. This is a really significant, ultimately constitutional moment that could have a really big impact in a variety of different ways, on a variety of different things, as far as our electoral process is concerned, on a state level and on a local level. So use all of your skills as historians, as educators, as informed members of the American public, as informed members of the public around the world, not even all Americans here, to think about what's happening, to evaluate it, and to inform yourself so that you have a view that at least is grounded in evidence and not grounded in pundits and partisans who will have very, very strong views about this. I will stop. I'm 7 minutes past and I'm blathering happily here. So mug. Okay. I will do the mug. This is not a new mug, but it's a mug that seemed on two levels significant for today. It's my James Madison mug. And it says, the advancement and diffusion of knowledge is the only guardian of true liberty. So on the one hand, read and inform yourself about this. All this stuff is out there. I mean, I sat on my couch here reading the Colorado decision and legal articles debating it, sitting on my couch. That's pretty amazing. Number two, of course, this is from James Madison, Mr. Constitution. So he also deserves at this particular moment to get a little bit of a shout out. So that is why I chose that mug. And now I will open things up for questions, open chat again so I can see what people are saying. I used to always print out my notes and I'd have paper and I could kind of see out of the corner of my eye on the bottom of the screen what people were saying. But now that I'm not printing them out, I have no idea what people are saying. So I'm kind of unprepared for the questions, but okay. I can't hear you, Annie.
Sorry about that. I said the chat has been on fire today and the links, Tim and everyone else with links has been going nuts.
Thank you guys. You can
and we
see
have some new friends
nuts.
today. We have at least 3 new people, Polly, Natalie, and I'm missing somebody else. Oh, and there's another Vicky. We have 2 Vickies now, which is great, Vicky B. So we've already signed them all up for Slack and old friends are here. Sydney didn't have class today, so she got to come for the whole thing. So it was really exciting. And we have lots of great questions, so we're going to dig in. We also are wondering, should we have a coffee service deliver a latte every Friday at 9:50? Because we're worried that you're not caffeinated enough.
Boy, I need coffee. I was so horrified this morning that I didn't have my coffee, and I meant to get it yesterday. And Starbucks has half off coffee on Thursday, so
Yeah.
it's asking for me to come, and I just was so busy I didn't. So, who knows whether someone should just send me coffee every Friday morning.
Yeah, we can make that happen.
Normally Thursdays I equip myself. But anyway, thank you
for that. Okay.
I should have been properly caffeinated today.
We decided in the chat that we could have a latte sent, and then if you're ever traveling on a Friday, the directions to the delivery person could be, if Joanne's on home, give to the bellman. And then every once in a while, your doorman would get a free latte. Okay. So I'm going to let Sydney go first because she's usually joining us after class. So,
and for those who don't know, Sydney is
undergrad.
Is an undergrad, a college undergrad.
And a history student, right? Sydney, aren't you majoring in history? Anyway, I'm trying to talk her into becoming a history teacher. So Sydney asked, if Donald Trump's been removed from the ballot in Colorado, do you think it'll hurt his chances of winning or not change his chances at all? Why or why not? She knows the 14th Amendment was passed. It was enforced in the South, so white Southerners could get around giving African Americans equal voting rights. But she's asking, like, why wasn't it enforced more and sped up during the civil rights movement? So how does this play out like in the modern era is basically what she's asking.
Well, I mean, it is centered on treason and insurrection against the government, right? So it is specific as far as not being applied more. Plus, for all the reasons that we're talking about this morning, it shouldn't be, willy-nilly applied to whatever. So, I mean, it's for good reason that it isn't applied a lot. The other question as to what it will do to Trump's chances, I have no idea, because and some of what I was reading this morning, they said on the one hand, if he's barred from the ballot, that might encourage other states to consider the same thing. On the other hand, it might make people who support Trump really, really, really angry. That would not be good. There was a lot of discussion on a variety of social media platforms that, they might be mad isn't a reason to not go through with constitutional or legal queries. But one way or another, this will get some people worked up, probably. What that will do to the former president's chances, that I don't know. I think we can make predictions. We can think about possibilities. I was very briefly on CNN on Wednesday, and you all would have been proud of me because I talked about the contingency of this current moment. That I don't know. We have a fascinating but somewhat unprecedented presidential moment going on legally, constitutionally. We have a very distinctive moment as far as the normalization of violence and a Republican Party that in many ways has gone off the rails. We have a candidate for president who is openly saying that being a dictator, he might be a dictator. Okay. We have people who are like, yeah, we're good with that. This is a moment. And I think given everything that I've just said and more, I don't know. None of us knows what's going to happen. It's why we're here. It's why we need to be informed. It's why we need to engage in discussion about this. It's why we need to really, really keep up on what's happening and consider what's happening and talk to others about what's happening and speak up about what's happening, and not just vote, but definitely vote. But in any number of ways, this is a moment that calls for an alert citizenry.
Absolutely. And especially young voters, they need to always vote, but we need young voters to start paying attention to these things, and tuning into programs like this can help them kind of unpack all this. So that's why we're always trying to encourage students to join us. Okay. Gloria. Hi, Gloria. We haven't seen Gloria in a while. Gloria says, what is the difference between this and when the Southern states did not put President Lincoln on the ballot? So she's asking you to comment on that.
Well, you're talking about before the Civil War. Mm-hmm. Well, again, that was a moment when already Southern states were like debating secession. So that, in a way, part of my answer to that would be, that's another moment. You know, the number of times people have said, hey, Professor Freeman, let's talk about the 1850s. That was a moment when, in some ways similar to now, there were some pretty fundamental constitutional questions and judicial questions being brought up that people didn't know how to deal with or weren't sure how to deal with, or were applying many different ways of dealing with it to see what would happen. You know, whenever I think about the weirdness, the strangeness of that moment to the people who were in it, and the fact that things were happening that hadn't happened before and the people didn't know how they felt about it, I think about the moment in Congress when Southern members of Congress were standing up and leaving Congress because their state had seceded from the Union. So think about that for a minute, right? They got instructions, their state had seceded from the Union, and state by state, not all on the same day, representatives of these states, congressmen from these states, stood up and said farewell and left. And their state left the Union in doing so. And there are accounts, you know, of people in the galleries just standing open-mouthed at what was happening. Members of Congress. There's, I'm not going to remember his name, but as this is going on, one member of Congress stands up and sort of says in disbelief, the Union is dissolved. That, you know, talk about moments when things are happening and it's not entirely clear what they mean. So to me, that entire period falls into a similar context to now, which is that definitions are being debated and made, norms are being tested, violated, maybe reinstituted. And in that sense, yeah, the 1850s, particularly the late 1850s and the present, have a lot in common.
All right. All right. Our good friend Cece is up. She said that she saw the New Yorker article by Jill Lepore. What
I
happened?
want to say something here though, because
Okay.
I see someone in comments and I do want to say it. Kathy and Dave, in 1860, there were not ballots like now. They were printed and distributed by agents of the candidates and their parties, which is indeed a version of what happened earlier in the period that I normally study, early America. People would create ballots, print them out, people who supported different candidates, and then hand them out to people, sometimes like already with the candidates they wanted, like checked off. So that's definitely worth noting, and thank you for saying that. And actually I'll make a broader point, which is thinking historically, what we assume about our political process now and what was going on in the political process in the 1860s, very, very, very different. So I appreciate the reminder from Dave and Kathy and Kevin.
And they still do that sometimes. I feel like when I go to I've been voting through the mail lately, but in the past, like some people would be standing, they have to be a certain amount of feet away from the poll, but they'll hand you a ballot that's already filled out and say, oh, if you need to take this in so you know what boxes to check. And I remember when I first started voting, that was very confusing to me.
Yeah.
20s, 18, 19.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
so, yeah. Okay, so Cece was mentioning this Jill Lepore article, what happened when the U.S. government failed to hold the Confederacy insurrectionist ex-president accountable after the Civil War. That is a long title. She said she dislikes the idea of what if history, but she's wondering if you could comment on that in relation today. This idea of like, what if, you know, we hadn't held the insurrectionists accountable? What if the president wasn't held accountable?
What if? I don't know. That's hard for me to answer, given what I just said, that it was such a different time that the what if is hard to equate with the present. I think that accountability, in a sweeping sense, is essential in any kind of a democratic form of government. Accountability for the actions, particularly of people with power, and their accountability to the people who gave them that power. You know, we've been talking about here on History Matters, we've been talking about accountability, the accountability of power holders, for a long time, and particularly since January 6th, right? Our people, not just the people who were there on the ground engaged in the protest, but people who in one way or another possibly facilitated that events of that day, the insurrection of that day, the attempt to intervene in a presidential election, which is what it was. I just lost track of where I was going, guys. This is what happens when I
Oh, what if thing, the whole what if scenario.
Oh, yeah. Well, anyway, I think it's difficult to make a what if situation given the historical difference in time. But I think that I think actually the contingency of the moment in both cases is perhaps the strongest similarity, and the one that bears the most importance to us right now is to be aware of the fact that we don't know what's going to happen, and that's worth considering.
Yeah, in the chat, she decided that she should have asked if it set a bad precedent.
Oh, did it set a bad precedent for holding them accountable?
I think that's what she meant.
Anyway, my larger point there was accountability is important. It's central. And when people aren't held accountable, that sets its own kind of precedent. Certainly, it shapes the tenor and the tone of government and what people think about it. In many ways, there's a lot of faith in the national government that's been eroded, particularly during the Trump presidency. But people right now, in a variety of different ways, I think, have lost a lot of faith in national institutions of government. Accountability and who is held accountable and how they're held accountable for what they do or what they have done is pretty important. In that case, part of the fear was just people in the South reinstituting some version of what had happened before. And, some of what that accountability enforcement was to prevent Southerners from basically going back to what a war had just been fought over. And the war had basically decided that issue. But, in that case, part of the problem of equating that is in that case, there was an actual war. And not just like, oh, they were violent, but an actual war. And that in and of itself has its own set of standards about victory and loss and who sets rules afterwards. And obviously our moment right now, even if some people are talking about violence, is a very different moment.
Okay, our good friend Dave asked, he says, the Colorado decision cites Justice Gorsuch when he was a circuit court judge, making the precise point that Colorado has the right to decide how to run its own elections. His question is, what is more important, the 14th Amendment, Section 3, or the constitutional right that states have to run elections the way they want? So he's asking that despite recent SCOTUS decisions to negate various sections of the Voting Rights Act, how do you interpret that?
Well, this is a debate about federalism, right? Right, like front and center. That's part of what we're talking about here. On the one hand, states, the idea that the states are concerned with and control much of what's going on within the states. And we've seen that, debated in any number of different ways, beginning not just for the first time, but when Donald Trump became president, that was raised in a number of ways, even just about COVID and what was happening, how people were or weren't enforcing rules about COVID, or where we've seen this question of federalism as to who has the ultimate power, states or the national government. That goes all the way back through all of American history. But right now, that's a big question. And with what we're facing right now, once again, it is. Colorado is doing something. It's why we're taking it to the Supreme Court, right? It is a question of federalism. And we take things to the Supreme Court to decide such cases that touch on fundamental aspects of American government and constitutionalism. And federalism, who has the right to do what and how, that was deliberately amorphous when that idea was put into the Constitution during the Constitutional Convention, right? People were afraid of nationalism, like a big national, cohered, powerful something. Federalism was a lot less scary at the time when the Constitution was being written and ratified. Federalism suggested that the states still had power, and this new government had power too. And there would be some things that it was clear the national government was in charge of, and some things that it would be clear the state governments were in charge of, and a vast middle ground where it was not necessarily clear, and that would be determined as time went on. And it was that the gray area, in many ways, that allowed the Constitution to be ratified, because it made it feel that whatever was happening was not going to simply take over everything from all the states. But the result of that throughout American history has been that we constantly have to debate questions of federalism. Who has sovereignty in a given situation? And obviously, in some cases, they're decided again and again and again, depending on what's happening legally, depending on who steps forward with an objection, depending on any number of things. It's a cliche to say that the Constitution is a living document, but the Constitution is a living document.
Yeah. All right. Tom Pinellas asks, to claim that Trump cannot be said to participate in an insurrection because he hasn't been convicted, shouldn't that be enough for the purposes of Section 3, where there have been civil processes of fact-finding and judgment in court, as what happened in Colorado? So he's asking, is that not enough that another judge has already found him guilty of participating?
Well, that's some of what they're discussing in Colorado. It is, and I sort of referenced it at some point, saying there doesn't have to be a conviction. Article 3 of the 14th Amendment doesn't say once you've been convicted of engaging in an insurrection, then it's self-executing. But it does, as Lawrence Tribe and Judge Ludwig said, it does mean that you really have to think about what rebellion or insurrection means, which is precisely where we are.
Okay. Jean, one of our longtime friends, says, what's the correct way to refer to the authors of constitutional amendments beyond the Bill of Rights? If they aren't founders, are they framers? Like, what do we call the people that hosted these or authored these amendments later on in history?
Well, I mean, generally speaking, I refer to the people who wrote the Constitution as framers, not founders, because they were framed. The Constitution is pretty specific, so that's an easy one. I suppose you could debate it, but and you could say that the people who created the Bill of Rights were many of them the same people who created the Constitution. So you could say that they were still framers. That's a fundamental. But whether you want to go through all of American history and say that everybody who took part in the process of creating an amendment becomes a framer, that's almost that's almost a case of semantics, right? Because at a certain point, creating amendments, it becomes part of the political process and then becomes part of the constitutional process. So I don't know where you draw that line. So I'm not personally, I suppose one could if one wanted to, but to me, because it's so bound up before it gets to a constitutional level with politics, who are the framers? Are you referring to the framers as the people who actually write the amendment? Are you referring to them as the people who are in a room debating the amendment? Are you including the people who step forward and say we need an amendment and work for the amendment? So anyway, this becomes yet another matter of definitions, and I'm not sure. I don't know how useful it is. But certainly, I suppose you could, if you wanted to define it that way, say that people who engage in the writing of framing an amendment that ends up being included in the Constitution are framers, constitutional framers in a way, since amendments then become part of the Constitution.
So Kay suggested reframers.
Reframers.
But Carol Lee said that her students sometimes accidentally call them farmers instead of framers.
Well, some of the early ones were farmers too, you could say. I don't like reframers because they're not reframing necessarily what came before, right? They're just framing something new. But I like farmers.
Yeah. And then Sean suggested later framers, and I suggested that was a good band name to add to our garage band name spreadsheet that apparently doesn't exist except in my head. But, we oftentimes have funny things added to the chat that we think would be good names for a band. So there's that. The farmers made me laugh, though. Okay, so Natalie asks, did anyone try to disqualify Eugene Debs when he was in prison and running for president? That might be a Tim find a link question.
That might be Tim find a link question. I mean, I don't know the answer to that. I know that people have run for office while in jail or prison other times and weren't necessarily disqualified, but I don't know the specific answer to this question.
Okay, maybe Tim can find that one for us with his link.
Magical Tim.
His magical link ability. Okay, Marty M. He said he heard yesterday on one of the shows that there's a conversation within the Republican Party in Colorado to switch to from a caucus to a primary. what would be the impact of that, he's asking? Would that have anything to do with
Well, I
what
don't know
we-
how that affects this.
Yeah.
Generally speaking, when you go back to the founding period and talk about look for what they're saying about caucuses, they didn't like caucuses because caucuses was it was a centralized meeting of people who made a decision. And there's all kinds of amusing talk by a variety of different founding era folk, I will never engage in a caucus. Like caucuses are anti-democratic, right? That for at least a time was one argument about caucuses, was that there was a small group of people making a decision for a larger whole, and for that reason was anti-democratic. I suppose in this case, you could say that a primary versus a caucus is more democratic. But we're, right now questioning what happens in a primary. So we're in one of those defining moments right now when it's interesting and exhausting to be a historian or a political scientist, or generally actually an American, I would say.
All right, we've got someone here whose name says administrator. So I don't know if this is a question coming from John or Claire, or just someone named themselves administrator in the chat. So I'm hoping this isn't like an anonymous post, like we've had that discussion before. It says one Trump supporter stated the term officers was not used to refer to the president. By that he would intend that Section 3 would not apply. Is it true in the common parlance that they did not consider the president an officer, but only legislators as officer?
Well, again, based on one of the articles that I read this morning by Kimberly Whale in The Atlantic, she says the president is referred to as an officer 25 times within the Constitution. So I don't think, however we want to debate who is or isn't included in Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, I'm not fully convinced that officer disqualifies the president. Again, we're going to see a lot of debate about this, and a decision will be made, and it will have implications, whatever that decision is. But I don't think, I think that's as cloudy as anything else. And again, given the moment that I mentioned earlier, in which a senator at the time said, why isn't the president included in this section of the 14th Amendment? And someone said, it says officer. That's open for debate.
Gotcha. All right. Greg asks, given the examining of words such as insurrection and rebellion currently being addressed in the United States, could this examination be expanded to how these terms could be applied to the United States War for Independence, or the Confederacy, or the United States Civil War?
Repeat the question for me.
He's asking the way that we've been examining words like insurrection and rebellion currently being addressed. He wanted to know if you could talk about how these terms were applied to the Revolutionary War for Independence, the Confederacy, and the United States in the Civil War.
Well, obviously these are big questions. The question of what is treason, who is a traitor, what does that mean, is bound up also with what is an insurrection, what is a rebellion, and defining them matters, but also just rhetorically using them, regardless of the definition, has a big impact as well. So, I can't necessarily specifically equate how that discussion has taken part over time. I can say it's certainly not the first time that we're debating something fundamental like this. And again, treason in and of itself, it's such a dire charge, and it too, over time, it has had to be debated. What is encompassed in treason? What does it mean? There are some things that are clearly treasonous, and there's some other things that are less clear, and we have to debate them. Debate is part of what democracy is about, right? Process, constitutional process, democratic process, debate and compromise. As frustrating as it can be, I'm encouraged at the fact that we're watching our system in operation. I don't know how I'll feel tomorrow or the next day, because we never know what's going to happen. But we're watching the system work its way through, and I think that's a positive sign.
Hey, it's 4 after. We have 3 more questions, but I don't know if we have time for all of those. It's up to you.
well, let's do one more because then I'm going to have a shorter after party too, because so let's do one more.
Okay, so Ellen is saying it seems like this isn't just a 14th Amendment issue, but also a 10th Amendment issue. Does the federal government have the power to compel the entries on a state ballot? If they don't have that express power, it should be reversed to the states by the 10th Amendment. She said, is this being a strict constructionist?
Repeat that again.
She's wondering if the 10th Amendment should also apply here, that the federal government, do they have the power to compel entries on an actual state ballot? And if they don't have that express power, should that be reserved only by the states according to the 10th Amendment?
Well, the question here, certainly in Colorado, is about the Colorado Secretary of State and what that person should or shouldn't do or can and can't do. So in the end, that's the question. Isn't the federal government saying, here's who shall be on the Colorado ballot? It's the Supreme Court saying, here is, in general, our view about what can and can't happen regarding, primaries on a state level. Can the Secretary of State step forward and enforce something or not enforce something in this way? It's not the federal government pronouncing who can or can't be on the ballot, but it is the federal government, the Supreme Court, coming forward and making a statement about how this process is supposed to work when there is a charge in that way rendered, what should happen after that point.
All right. Well, we are 6 minutes after, so I'm guessing we want to
You should
segue.
probably, I know, you guys, actually, even before I go on, I'm saving this because I know there are all of these wonderful links.
Yeah.
Any of
gosh,
you
the
who are
links.
here, if you're here for the first time, folks, save the chat because this community is amazing in linking to all kinds of things, references, articles, sources, that it's very much worth going back to. I think, Carolee, did you link all of the links together?
Yep. Carolee has this site she uses. If you're not a teacher, you're probably not a person that uses Wakelet like teachers do every day. But Wakelet is a place where you can gather collections of links and then push them out easily to your students or to your friends, like in this community. So she takes all the links out of the chat every week and archives them in a Wakelet and then shares that because she's such a good human. So anyway, and we have a lot of new folks today. So, and yes, she is a rock star, Julia, I agree.
She is, and that's anyway. So folks, worth knowing, not only save the chat, but the Wakelet is going to have all the links, and particularly this discussion, as I said at the outset, it's going to be a lot of stuff here that you're going to want to read and think about and consider for yourself what you believe in this moment to be important and how you view it. Now, we should, and so we can at least have a little bit of an after party. For those of you who are new, here's what normally happens now. We segue into the after party. What that means is that we stop recording so that we can be even freer and easier in our conversation than we were before. If you beamed in through the NCHE link, the NCHE website, just stay right where you are and momentarily, poof, you will be in the after party. If you are watching us from Facebook, you need to leave Facebook and go to ncheteach.org/conversations. That's ncheteach.org/conversations. And then you too, poof, will be in the after party. I do want to mention one last thing before I thank you for being here, which I will do momentarily. And that is Annie and Carolee, I got a mug. And it made me cry. In a good way. It did. I got it yesterday and I opened it and it made me cry. But I have to share it with the community before we go to the after party. For those of you who are new to the community here, we've been doing this 194 times before today. Like we've been doing this for a really long time and the community here is amazing. But Annie and Carolee made this mug in loving memory of Newbie Freeman, the history bird. And it says, award-winning, wise, fun, humorous, sweet, brave, feisty, loving, and thoughtful history bird, passionately and tirelessly peeping and oodling for democracy. Rest in peace, sweet, sweet friend. Which, as I said, made me cry. And then it has like these great little newbie photos, and then a little portrait of the history bird. You guys, that was the nicest thing. It did make me cry because it was so nice. And because, again, for those of you who are new here, Newbie the history bird was a member of our community in addition to being a huge part of my life, and he died a couple of weeks ago, the noobs. And so this community has been so supportive, and I really appreciate it. He really peeped up. He was here every week taking part in the discussion. So anyway, thank you guys. That was supremely wonderful that you guys did that. Okay. Now I want to say thank you to everyone who's come here to engage in this discussion, as we have now 195 times. It matters a lot. A discussion like today shows why it matters a lot, because we can ask pretty basic questions. We can decide, think about what they mean. We can exchange information about where to find things, how to research things, how to inform ourselves. And because the fact that there is a community of people engaged here and caring so fundamentally about this issue, that's important in and of itself. And it should also be encouraging, because we're not sort of sitting back with our mouths open, allowing things to happen. We're here, we're asking questions, we're debating things, deciding what we feel, and ideally then speaking up, potentially taking action, right? This matters. This is a moment, we live in a moment when being a citizen matters a lot, being an active, engaged citizen. So History Matters is part of that, in addition to being an amazing community that can't be nearer or dearer to my heart. It also matters that we're here every week doing this kind of work to debate and consider democracy, what it is, how it reaches, what it can be, what we should protect it from. So, okay.
We're still recording and we're still on Facebook, so I don't know if Claire or John want to turn that off.
Oh, that's right. So we do need